Now, this blue lake that you will see behind me, high in the Himalayas, is the scene of an unfolding military standoff between India and China. Troops from both countries stationed along the banks of the Pangong Lake have now accused each other of firing shots. If true, it would be the first time in more than 4 decades that shots have been fired on the disputed border. It's a border that stretches for some 3,500 kilometers and is undemarcated. Since May, troops from both countries have been amassing at various points after both sides accuse the other of violating each other's claimed territory. I'll be getting the view from India and China in a bit, but first, a quick primer on what's been happening since May.
A remote mountain region for which soldiers have died and superpowers faced off. Tuesday's incident along India's Ladakh border with China risks a fresh standoff in one of the world's most explosive border conflicts. The red line marks the boundary, around 3,500 kilometers long, between these nuclear-armed rivals. Known as the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, it is not a hard border. China and India have never agreed on where it should lie. Tensions began soaring in May. Both sides assembled troops in the area amid reports that Chinese soldiers had crossed the borders at various points and set up camps on territory claimed by India. China ordered its military to prepare for, quote, worst-case scenarios in the area. On June 15th, the two sides clashed on a steep mountainside. 20 Indian soldiers were killed, with Chinese casualties unknown. Firearms had been banned to prevent escalation, but Chinese troops allegedly used weapons like iron-spiked rods in hand-to-hand combat. An Indian source passed this image to the BBC. The deadly clashes sparked protests across India. Demonstrators burned effigies of Chinese leader Xi Jinping and demanded boycotts of Chinese goods. Beijing said it was defending its territorial integrity, accusing Indian troops of crossing the border twice and provoking Chinese soldiers. And tensions have not subsided since, as India's army chief confirmed just a few days ago.
Well, the situation along the LAC is slightly tense. Keeping in view of the situation, we had undertaken some precautionary deployments for our own safety and security, and these deployments we undertook along the LAC.
Both sides traded blame for Tuesday's incident, each saying the other had fired the shots.
So what happens next? Anant Krishnan is China correspondent for the Hindu newspaper and author of the book India's China Challenge. And Victor Gao is vice president of the Center for China and Globalization and a man who knows the thinking in China's Communist Party. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Mr. Gao, I'd like to begin with you first. China has called India's alleged moves in the Pangong Lake area a grave military provocation. What does China expect to see happen next to ease tensions?
Well, we understand tensions are rising along the disputed line of actual control between China and India in the western part of their border. And this does not bode well. From the Chinese perspective, China does not want to have a war with India, and China wants to do whatever it can to calm down the situation, to negotiate or talk about a solution or calming down of the tensions. But it doesn't seem that the situation is going that way, and it is learned that firing happened on the Indian side, which actually broke a record of almost 40 years. This is very alarming. I personally do not want to see any flaring up of tension or military conflicts between China and India, which I've called two superpopulations in the world. They need to have peace and stability rather than war and conflicts.
We need to have peace and stability. Anant Krishnan, in Chennai, how can peace and stability be achieved?
I think that's the question. And I think the latest events that we've seen in the last few days are worrying for two reasons. The first is it's a new front And we've already had 4 or 5 different spots along the LAC where there's been high tension since May. And of course, we had the terrible loss of life on June 15th in the Galwan Valley. And I think this new sector in south of Pangong Lake shows that all the talks that both sides have been having haven't really achieved much headway. Rather than diffuse the situation, we're now having a new front, and I think that's extremely worrying. And as Victor said, I think that the fact that there is firing for the first time since 1975 is a huge concern. The Indian Army said that the Chinese side had fired first in trying to dislodge India's forward positions. The Chinese have said India fired first, so it's a classic case of he said, she said. But I think looking forward, one can only hope that the talks between India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and his counterpart Wang Yi tomorrow in Moscow hopefully can pave the way for some kind of understanding between the two sides. But I'm a little concerned only because we had talks at various levels between NSAs, foreign ministers, defense ministers since May. And so far, there's very little reason for optimism, I'm afraid.
Let's see what Victor Gao has to say on that. Victor Gao, as Anant mentioned, lots of rounds of talks. There have been something like 5 rounds of talks as far as ground commanders are concerned. NSA-level talks have happened, as Anant mentioned. What exactly is China expecting from these foreign minister-level talks that are due to be held in Moscow?
Well, I think China wants to have as many talks as needed to avoid a war or military conflict between China and India, because China does not want to have a war. But it doesn't mean that China is afraid of a war against India, for example. We truly believe that neither India nor China should be involved in a war against each other, the two largest populations in the world. So I think China will be very, very patient in talking to the Indian side to rationalize everything and to give out the pros and cons of peace versus war, for example. And I hope India will also be rational and will be reasonable and will not be pushed forward by another big power, which may actually have its own geopolitical schemes, try to promote a war between India.
Victor Gao, you almost make it sound like the solutions lie entirely with India. What would you have India do?
No, I think both China and India need to calm down and withdraw from the line of actual control, which may actually cause more tensions to rise. And both sides need to have cool head rather than rednecks, as we sometimes call, to agitate the situation and to promote the getting out of the control or getting out of the proportion of the friction points on the ground, which is very, very dangerous. If control of the situation is lost in the western section of China-Indian border, I assume it will also be lost in the eastern section. More than 2,000 kilometers long of border between China and India may be up in great conflict. And this will drag down both India and China for many years.
Right, and most of that border still appears to be undemarcated and unresolved. And here is where I come to you, Anant. You've been a foreign correspondent in China for a number of years. What, according to you, is the reason this border remains unresolved for so many decades?
The Chinese like to say it's leftover from history. But I think the biggest problem has been that China has, for many reasons, stalled on demarcating the line of actual control. So this is different from settling the dispute, which of course is going to be very complicated, given that territory is something that evokes emotions of both countries. But I think the most rational thing for both sides to do is to sit and clarify the LAC and their different perceptions of the LAC, rather than settle the boundary. And by doing that, they can avoid the kind of incidents we've seen since May. And frankly speaking, for many years, I've tried to figure out why China doesn't want to clarify the LAC. They seem to prefer ambiguity. And I think that that really hasn't helped the situation. And the one point that I would make since May, I think the biggest problem has been a mismatch between what we've been hearing from Chinese officials about wanting peace and the actions of the PLA on the ground. There seems to be a huge gulf. And the biggest, I think, evidence of that is since May, India has lost access to about 1,000 square kilometers where it used to patrol previously.
Right.
And I think that really shows where the changes have been made on the ground unilaterally to the very tense situation that we had previously. And I think going back to what it was before May is something that India would demand in the talks that will be had in the next few days.
Victor Gao, last question to you. Is China playing a double game?
No, I don't think so. I think as to what happened in the deep night of June the 15th, even Prime Minister Modi of India said that the Chinese military was not on the Indian side of the line of actual control.
Right.
And if you really look into specifics, you will know it was the Indian soldiers penetrating into the Chinese side of the LAC and resulting in a brawl and resulting in about 20 soldiers losing their life. Now, we need to be very specific. We need to be very pragmatic in terms of dealing with these very inflammatory situation along the China-Indian LAC. But the mega trend is that both China and India need to embrace peace and stability rather than being agitated one way or another onto a very, very destructive path of war and conflict.
We'll have to leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Ananth Krishnan in Chennai and Victor Gao in Beijing. Thank you so much for your time.